Welcome to this Engaging the Mind program sponsored by Lifetime Learning. My name is Mary Lynn Musser, and I am an engagement associate with Lifetime Learning at the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. Over 700 people registered for today's talk, and we are excited to share this event with nature lovers and bird watchers everywhere. Today, I am pleased to introduce David Carr, who will be speaking on the wonder of fall migration. Dave is a research professor of environmental sciences in the College and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Virginia. He is also the director of UVA's Blandy Experimental Farm and State Arboretum of Virginia in Boyce, Virginia. Dave has been birding all over North America, from the Bering Strait to the Everglades, and in a few other countries. He has recorded 214 species of birds during his 23 years at Blandy Farm and has taken beautiful photos with what he calls his magic camera. Dave will respond to a few questions after his presentation. Some of you submitted questions in advance of this program, and you may also enter a question in the webinar chat box. Please add your name and UVA affiliation to your question. You can also find links to resources that Dave has shared, as well as links to his recent interviews with UVA Today and Radio IQ in the webinar chat box. This program is being recorded and will soon be available in Lifetime Learning's podcast library. And now, we welcome our speaker, David Carr.
Thank you, Mary Lynn. So as Mary Lynn said, I'm in the Department of Environmental Sciences. I'm a plant ecologist. I'm not an ornithologist, but I got interested in birds back when I was a teenager growing up in Kentucky. My best friend and next door neighbor, who is now an ornithologist at Auburn University, got me interested. And as Mary Lynn indicated, I got hooked. And I have traveled all over North America in pursuit of birds. I've been out to St. Lawrence Island. I've been out to the Dry Tortugas, 60 miles off the coast of Florida, all in pursuit of trying to see birds that you can find nowhere else in North America. This love for birds is taken me all over the United States. And in many ways, that's the greatest gift that this love has given me. I've gotten to see places that I probably never would have seen if I hadn't been interested in birds. But of course, this year's been a little bit different than most years. And most of us, birder or not, our travels have been restricted, and we haven't been able to get around very much. The great thing about birds, though, is that despite the fact that we're not able to get around, the birds do come around to us, especially here in the Northern Hemisphere, and in particular in Virginia. The birds change with the season, and so when you go outside, what you see from one day to the next will change. And there are probably no more dynamic months than from September through November, fall migration here in Virginia. Now, my talk is going to have a little bit of a Virginia-centric focus, because that's where I spend most of my time, do most of my birding and most of my photography. But fall migration occurs all over the United States. In fact, fall migration occurs all over the Northern Hemisphere. And although the characters change as you move from one place to another, this movement of birds north in the spring and then back south in the fall is essentially universal in the Northern Hemisphere. Before I get to the birds, though, I want to talk a little bit about where I'm coming from here. And normally, if we were in a lecture hall in a live talk, I'd ask for a show of hands to see who in the audience knows about Blandy Experimental Farm. But I'm not able to do that today, but the good folks at Lifetime Learning are going to be able to do a little bit of polling during this talk. And my first poll question to the audience is just to check on what your familiarity is with Blandy. But for those who are uninitiated, Blandy is a 700-acre ecological field station. We're located about 2 hours north of Charlottesville in the Shenandoah Valley in Clark County, about 10 minutes from Winchester, Virginia, about 60 miles west of Washington, D.C. We're part of the College of Arts and Sciences. The 3 research faculty up here are members of the Department of Environmental Sciences. And our mission is to increase the knowledge of the natural world through research and through training. And we do this primarily by the faculty research here and by bringing undergraduate and graduate student researchers to Blandy. Blandy is also home to the State Arboretum of Virginia, and we have a very strong public outreach program. We have a K-12 program that serves not only all of our local school districts, but provides professional development opportunities for teachers all over the state of Virginia. We have public programs for people of all ages, and we are open to the public under normal times, 365 days a year. But since COVID, we have been open since early June. We had a brief period of time there where we had to close to the public. But that, in the 23 years I've been here, that's the only time we've ever been closed to the public. So if you have been to Blandy, that's absolutely great. If you haven't been to Blandy, I invite you to come by, either make a special trip up here, or the next time you're up in the Northern Virginia area. We'd love for you to come and see your state arboretum. Looks like from the polling here, about 40% of the audience has never heard of Blandy, and another 40% has heard of us and has never had the opportunity to get here. So now all of you know about us, and we really hope to see you sometime soon. So migration. So the people of the Northern Hemisphere have known for millennia that many of the birds they know well during the summer disappear during the winter. But it's been surprisingly recent that we know or had any idea as to what was going on. 2,400 years ago, Aristotle, one of our first great Western natural philosophers, hypothesized that these birds hibernated during the winter, and that's where they disappeared. It really wasn't until the 1800s that the idea that birds might migrate, that they might move to faraway places, began to gain some support and popularity. And one of the first real concrete pieces of evidence came in Germany in 1822. So the white stork is a really common bird in Europe. In fact, it nests on rooftops in Europe. But in the wintertime, white storks disappeared. In 1822 in Germany, this particular white stork, the Fielstork or arrow stork, showed up with an arrow right through its neck. And that arrow was determined to be of African in origin. And the Fielstork was the first solid piece of evidence that the birds that nested on the rooftops in Europe were disappearing and traveling thousands of miles to another continent, and probably spending the winter in Africa. Of course, nowadays it's widely accepted and widely understood that birds migrate between the northern hemisphere and the tropics here in North America and the paleotropics in Eurasia. But we're still finding out amazing details about how migration works and how birds get to their breeding grounds and their wintering grounds. Some of the first pioneering experiments on migration took place in the 1960s. This photograph here on the right is inside a planetarium. Steve and John Emlen came up with this brilliant but simple idea to test how birds might use the stars for navigation. And the subject of their study was the indigo bunting, one of our very common migrants here in Virginia and the eastern United States. So what the Emlens did was to capture indigo buntings during their spring migration and put them in cages inside a planetarium. At night, the indigo buntings would get restless in their cages and they'd start flapping around. The bottom of the cage was an ink pad, just like an old library stamp pad. And the wall of the cage was made out of a paper funnel. And as the birds fluttered around, they would mark the walls of their cage with their inky feet. And the Emlens saw that they had a northward trajectory toward the North Star. The next day, if the Emlens shifted the planetarium, say they moved the North Star to the east, when the birds got restless at night and started fluttering around in their cage, they shifted their orientation accordingly. And so this was the first evidence that birds, in fact, use stars, just like humans have been doing for thousands of years, to navigate on their migration. Steve Emlen later discovered that hormonal changes in the birds change their response to these stars. So when they're hyped up on estrogen and testosterone in the fall, their response to these stars is to orient north. But as these hormone levels drop, in the spring, they orient north. When they drop in the fall, they turn around and start orienting to the south. So is sort of ingenious but simple as those experiments were back in the 60s, our technology for studying migration has really improved over the years. And we'll be talking a little bit about the technology as we go on through this talk. But one of the really informative pieces of technology has been weather radar. In the spring and in the fall, birds migrate in such huge numbers that they show up on weather radar all over the United States. And we now have a huge database on where and when birds are traveling. You can now go to a website called Birdcast and see live data on where birds are moving. And so I stole a screenshot from about 1:30 in the evening on October 1st from Birdcast. And you can see that birds are moving in great numbers through the upper Midwest and down from the Carolinas into Florida on that evening. We've gotten so much data from the weather radar on bird migration that Birdcast now gives a migratory forecast for 1 day in advance of what migration might look like that night. And so in preparing for this talk, I got the most recent forecast that I could get, which was for last night. And what you can see in this graph is that in the mid-Atlantic, not much is going on, but these bright colors in Texas and in the Mississippi and Tennessee valleys, they had an incredible migration through there overnight. By the way, I did check on the forecast for tonight's migration. And if you are in the mid-Atlantic, if you're in Virginia or anywhere along the East Coast, Birdcast is forecasting tomorrow to be absolutely fabulous for migration in our area here in Virginia. So most of the birds that migrate in North America are what we call neotropical migrants. And a very good example bird of the neotropical migrant is the bobolink, a handsome member of the Blackbird family. So bobolinks winter in South America in open habitat in Brazil down into Argentina. In the spring, as the days start to get longer, bobolinks start moving north out of South America up to the Yucatan Peninsula and across the Gulf of Mexico into the Gulf Coast, and eventually spreading out in late April into the Mid-Atlantic region and grassland habitats in the Midwest, all the way up into central Canada. In the fall, or late summer really, bobolinks molt, and those fancy looking males start looking pretty much like females. They're pretty much indistinguishable. The bobolinks begin to flock up, and they begin to move toward the East Coast. They reach the coast, and then they launch themselves over the Atlantic Ocean and fly back down to South America and winter again in Brazil down to Argentina. So there are almost too many things about this migration that we can get into in a 50-minute talk, but two of the things that really strike me about this migration is amazing is, first of all, the distance. A bobolink might travel 12,000 miles round trip in its annual migration. And the other striking thing is these huge flights over wide expanses of inhospitable ocean. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into our talk here. But this is a dangerous trip, you know, flying over the ocean, flying 12,000 miles. Many millions of birds perish on this trip. So not everybody makes it to the breeding grounds, and certainly not everybody makes it back to South America. So you have to wonder why birds dare this trip at all. Why do they risk their lives to spend the summer up here in North America? And the short answer to that important question is food. So as the days get longer and warmer here in the spring in North America, invertebrates start coming back to life, and they start breeding and multiplying. And by April and May, North America is just teeming with insects and other invertebrates. What this represents to a bird in South America is a tremendous potential food resource, especially a protein resource that could be exploited if they made the trip from their wintering grounds up here. And so that's exactly what happens. The birds come up here and they start grabbing insects. They start feasting on insects. And most importantly, they start taking insects like this yellow-billed cuckoo with its caterpillar and turning those insects into baby birds, or in this case, a baby cuckoo. So these insects represent the primary protein food to make baby birds. So this brings us to our birdiest part of the talk. And so if we were live, I'd ask another question of my audience and just get a feel for what kind of birders we have in the audience. And so if you could take a few seconds and give me an idea of what your birding experience is, I'd really like to see what kind of audience I'm dealing with here. So while you're working on that homework assignment, I want to talk for a minute about just who these neotropical migrants are. So there's an official legal definition of neotropical migrants from the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act. The definition is that the bird has to primarily breed in Canada or the United States, and at least 5% of its population must winter in either the Caribbean, Mexico, or on further south. And under this definition, 386 species of birds, which is over half of the birds that breed in North America, qualify as neotropical migrants. But even if you make a stricter definition requiring, say, most of the population to winter south of the US border, even the state of Virginia has well over 100 species of birds that would qualify as neotropical migrants. There are about 11 orders of birds that make up the bulk of the neotropical migrants here in Virginia. They include many of our ducks, all of our nightjars, the whippoorwills and nighthawks. In Virginia, we have one hummingbird and one swift, and they are both neotropical migrants. Both of our cuckoos are neotropical migrants. Most of our rails, one of our grebes, the pied-billed grebe, is a neotropical migrant. But the first really big group of neotropical migrants are the shorebirds, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in just a bit. Many of our herons and ibises are neotropical migrants. Some of our hawks are neotropical migrants. A couple of our falcons are neotropical migrants. But by far and away, the biggest group of neotropical migrants are the songbirds, which shouldn't be surprising because the songbirds are the largest order of birds, not only in North America, but anywhere in the world. So if we took a little bit closer look at the songbirds, what we see are certain families are overrepresented as neotropical migrants. These families include the flycatchers. So all of our flycatchers are neotropical migrants. All of our vireos and all of our swallows are neotropical migrants. Our catbirds and most of our thrushes are neotropical migrants. One of our two kinglets, the ruby crown, is a neotropical migrant. Our one and only gnatcatcher, about half of our wrens here in Virginia are neotropical migrants. Sparrows, one of our largest songbird families here in Virginia, are sort of underrepresented as neotropical migrants, but there's still a handful of species that make the journey. Our cardinals, many of our cardinals, and by cardinal, I'm using that in the modern term. Our state bird, the northern cardinal, is not a neotropical migrant, but birds like buntings, grosbeaks, and tanagers are. Our one and only chat is a neotropical migrant. Several of our blackbirds, the orioles and the bobolink I mentioned earlier, are neotropical migrants. But by far and away, the biggest family of birds are the warblers. So let's take a little bit closer look here at the warblers. So for many birders, these are the stars of migration. In the spring, the warblers are among our most colorful and beautiful birds. They also tend to have really beautiful, enjoyable songs. And they come up here in large numbers and, as I said, very, very diverse numbers. So with over 30 species. So what I have here pictured is about 1/3 of the species of warblers that typically pass through Virginia during migration. Now, some of these really are just passing through. So for example, the Cape May warbler doesn't breed in Virginia. It passes through, works its way up into New England and into the boreal forest of Canada to breed. But everybody else on this page breeds. In fact, I think I could find breeding birds of every one of these other species within just a couple hours drive of Blandy Experimental Farm. Some, like the yellow rump warbler, the magnolia warbler, and the Blackburnian warbler, are boreal forest species, and in Virginia, they're restricted just to the highest mountains in Virginia. But others are widespread throughout the state. So for example, the common yellowthroat, the yellow warbler, the northern parula, they are probably found in every county of Virginia as breeders. Now, in the late summer, just like that bobolink I showed you earlier, the warblers molt. And these fancy male warblers lose a little bit of their luster, but they're still among our most colorful birds. One of the things I really like about fall warblers is that there are a lot more of them than there were in the spring, because only adults migrate north in the spring, but in the south, those adults, in the fall, those adults head south along with all their offspring. So almost by definition, after the breeding season, there are more warblers for birders to see. So here's the results of our poll. It looks like we've got some backyard birders and some pretty casual birders, but it looks like we have a fair number of pretty hardcore birders. And I certainly identify with those hardcore birders, but I also love the backyard birders and the casual birders. And maybe with a little more prompting, we can make the backyard birders take their binoculars out a little bit more and maybe turn a couple of those casual birders into more hardcore birders. So after the breeding season, the warblers are still voraciously hungry. So they finish feeding their babies, but they still have very high energetic needs for the southward leg of their migration in the fall. So northern parulas are still going after caterpillars, and they eat so many of these insects that if you look under their feathers, so this is the breast of a magnolia warbler where the bird bander has blown apart, blown the feathers apart so that you can see the skin underneath the feathers. You can see these huge yellow blobs of fat under the skin. So those big blobs of fat are the energy reserves that these birds are going to need on their fall migration. And a properly conditioned warbler in the fall is going to have about 23% of its body mass is pure fat. And without it, as you'll see, they would not be able to make the trip. Because of this need to feed as they're moving in migration, I find the best places to look for warblers are in the early morning. Find the forest edges that are getting that morning sunlight. That early morning sunlight lights up that area, it warms up that area, the insects get active, and that brings in these insect-eating birds like warblers. And so I birded this little trail here most mornings this fall, and I typically get 20 to 30 species of neotropical migrants in about an hour's walk. So let's take a closer look at one of these neotropical migrating warblers. In his first field guide to the birds, Roger Torrey Peterson had a special section for confusing fall warblers. Because warblers molt in the fall, they lose a lot of their distinctive coloration, and probably no fall warbler typifies the confusing fall warbler better than the blackpoll warbler. You'll see a photo in a minute of what it looks like in its breeding plumage. But this is a picture of a blackpoll that I took just a couple weeks ago in my backyard. And despite its rather plain and unassuming appearance, this bird has an absolutely fabulous migration story to tell. So this bird weighs about 12 grams. And for reference, that is about the mass of a single AAA battery. This bird comes up from South America and works its way up into the boreal forests of New England all the way to Alaska. And they breed in the boreal forests up there. At the end of the breeding season, they start to move south and east to the East Coast. And the Alaskan birds that are the furthest away take about 18 days to make the trip. Once they arrive on the East Coast, they start that voracious feeding that I talked about. And it takes them, on average, about 26 days to acquire enough fat for the next major part of their trip, which is a 1,700-mile migration over the Atlantic Ocean to the coast of South America. They do this trip mostly nonstop, and they are able to do it in about 60 hours. Just an absolutely amazing feat for such a tiny bird. Once in South America, they work their way down to the Amazon basin for a total mileage of a bird coming from, say, Nome, Alaska, of about 6,650 miles. Just totally breathtaking for a 12-gram bird. So you might ask, how in the world do we know all this exact information about a blackpoll warbler? And it turns out that although this migration route has been suspected for a very long time, the actual data to support it has only recently come to light. The paper I'm going to talk about here was only published last year in 2019. So William DeLuca and his colleagues at the University of Massachusetts captured blackpoll warblers, and this is a nice, pretty breeding plumage male blackpoll warbler, in Churchill, Manitoba, Whitehorse, Yukon Territory, Denali National Park, and up here at the extreme part of the range in Nome, Alaska. And they put little geo-trackers on these birds. Now, these geo-trackers are probably not what you think. So they are not GPS devices, and they're not satellite transmitters. The warblers are just too small to be able to support those types of tracking devices and transmitters. This geo-tracker weighs about 1/2 gram, and the only thing it's capable of doing is keeping time in telling when the sun rises, when it gets light, and when the sun sets, when it gets dark. And that's the only information this geo-tracker records. But if you know what time the sun rises and what time the sun sets, you can pinpoint your location on the globe. And so the researchers, DeLuca and his colleagues, used that daylight information to make a map of where these blackpoll warblers were moving. The trick is, though, that these geo-trackers don't transmit their data. And so the only way to get the data from the geo-tracker is to take it back off the bird after it's done its migration. And so after banding and outfitting these birds in the boreal forest of Canada and Alaska, they completed their migration. They went down to South America, but birds are such amazing navigators that most of the birds they banded found their way back to Churchill, Whitehorse, Denali, and Nome, where they were recaptured by DeLuca, and the transmitters were received. From then they could download the data and produce this amazing map that's telling us the story of the blackpoll warbler. Now, warblers aren't the only neotropical migrants. I mentioned another huge group of neotropical migrants are the shorebirds, and they have some pretty mind-blowing migration stories themselves. These are two of our common shorebirds that pass through Virginia, but they breed way up in northern Canada and Alaska, the least sandpiper and the semi-palmated plover. So these birds would easily fit in the palm of your hand, but these little birds travel over 5,000 miles in each direction, including often over 2,000 miles over the Atlantic Ocean nonstop. And one of the amazing things about shorebird migration is, even though I have it in our category of fall migration for shorebirds starts in July, and it starts with the adults. So the adults get up to the Arctic, they breed, they have their babies, and then they abandon them. And the adults start flying down here, arriving in Virginia in late July, and the young of the year don't start showing up here until about a month later. Having never flown out of the Arctic before, they somehow find their way all the way back down to South America. As shorebirds get bigger, their migrations can get longer. So the lesser yellowlegs, for example, migrates over 7,500 miles. Even familiar birds that we see on the beach have amazing stories to tell. Sanderlings and ruddy turnstones migrate between 9,000 and over 11,000 miles in one direction. Whimbrels are larger shorebirds, and they're now getting large enough where you can put a real-time GPS tracker. And in fact, Researchers at William and Mary Center for Conservation Biology have done just that, and they've been able to track the entire migration route of whimbrels. And I read one amazing story of one of their birds, a bird they nicknamed Chinkapin, who in 2011 was on its transatlantic migration, flying straight at Hurricane Irene, a Category 3 storm. Chinkapin was able to navigate around the northeast bands of the storm and come out the other side alive. The champion sandpiper for long distance migration is the red knot. The red knot winters at the tip of South America and Tierra del Fuego and breeds all the way up at the Arctic Circle in northern Canada. A trip that is over 11,000 miles in one direction. From banding data, we know that there are red knots who have flown this route enough times that they have flown the equivalent of the distance between the Earth and the Moon in their lifetime, nearly 250,000 miles. The champion of all bird migration is the Arctic tern. And I've mostly been emphasizing birds here that we can see from land here in Virginia. The Arctic tern, though, migrates off the coast of Virginia on its route from below the Antarctic Circle to above the Arctic Circle, a one-way migration of over 12,000 miles that make it the longest distance migration of any bird in the world. Now, these neotropical migrants, though, they're not the only migrants out there. There are other groups of birds that are migrating. I mentioned earlier, our hawks include some neotropical migrants. For example, the broadwing hawk. The entire population of broadwing hawks spends the winter in South America, but many of these hawks are just migrating to get to warmer climates in the southern United States. Hawks have migration patterns that tend to concentrate around the mountains and the coast. And so there are particular places in Virginia that are particularly good to watch hawk migration. So if you're down in the Charlottesville area, Rockfish Gap is on the Nelson-Augusta County border. And in a good fall day, you can see over 10,000 species of hawks migrating through Rockfish Gap. Snickers Gap is closer to the Northern Virginia, DC area on the Loudoun-Clark County border, not far from Blandy. And you can have the same experience up there at Snickers Gap. Another place to watch hawk migration is out on the eastern shore at Kiptopeek State Park. A little bit further afield are a couple of birding meccas, the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania and Cape May State Park in New Jersey. And Cape May and Kiptopeek share something in common in that they're on these narrow peninsulas right before birds have to cross a big expanse of water, either the Delaware Bay or the Chesapeake Bay. And so those areas tend to concentrate birds. And so they're not only great for raptors, they're great for songbird migration and shorebird migration. Here in mid-October, migration is starting to wane for neotropical migrants, but we're starting to get short distance migrants coming from the boreal forest, species like yellow-bellied sapsuckers, winter wrens, gold-crowned kinglets, and rusty blackbirds, and from the tundra, birds like horned larks and American pipits are beginning to come down. I've seen all of these birds this week at Blandy. Sparrows. Now I know for a lot of birders, these are just little brown birds, but the sparrow migration really begins in earnest here in October, coming from the grasslands of the Midwest, the boreal forest of Canada, and again from the tundra of Canada and Alaska. A number of species don't come down every year. They're what we call eruptive species, and they are responding to local food conditions up in the boreal forest, the pine cone crop up there. And 2020 is shaping up to be a great year for these eruptive species. Right now at Blandy, we have a flock of over 100 pine siskins, lots of purple finches, and lots of red-breasted nuthatches. The most prized eruptive species are the crossbills, so named because they're of their unusual bill here that they use to feed on pine cones. They only erupt about once every 10 years, but we haven't had an eruption here in Virginia since 2012. So we're due for one soon. And so I have my fingers crossed for this year. So I hope I'm getting you excited about these fall migrants, but there's also some bad news about these migrants that I have to mention. So even though a bird like the Cape May warbler is, I think, very common at Blandy during fall migration, since 1966, Cape May warbler populations have declined by about 70%. Grassland species like this neotropical migrant, the grasshopper sparrow, have seen the biggest declines. Grasshopper sparrows have declined by about 74% since 1966. One of the sharpest decline of all songbirds in North America is the rusty blackbird. And right now, for every 10 rusty blackbirds that migrated down here in 1966, there's only one showing up this fall. And even the red knot, the bird that migrates between Tierra del Fuego and the Arctic, is seeing huge declines, 50%, cut in half since 1985. And a bird like the red knot really illustrates how difficult it is to conserve these species, because the red knot passes through 2 continents and in many, many countries along the way. Very hard to coordinate a conservation strategy. One last poll I'd like to take. There's a lot of people here. There are over 300 people in this little webinar. That shows a great interest in birds, and I'd love to know just how involved you might be in bird conservation. And so if you just check and let us know which of these kinds of things you're taking part in. So if you aren't already a member of a conservation organization, take a look at conservations either local to you or national or international, and think about becoming a member. Another thing you can do is feed the birds. And now I realize I said that most of these neotropical migrants are here to eat insects, and you probably won't find bags of insects if you check the bird feeding section at Lowe's. But insect feeders are all around us. They're called plants, and insects like caterpillars literally grow on trees. And so landscaping your yard in native plants, which are way more likely than exotic plants to host the insects that these birds need, can really improve their chances. I've emphasized insects, but many of our fall migrants need fruit during their migration, especially the thrushes and the catbirds. And so if you landscape with fruiting trees, you can provide both the insects for those insect eaters and fruits for birds like this hermit thrush. Don't worry about feeding, setting out feeders. A lot of people are anxious these days about putting out feeders, but as long as you clean those feeders, you are probably providing a net benefit for the birds. Black oiled sunflower seed, thistle seed, and suet feeders are great, especially for those eruptive species I mentioned. And of course, don't forget your hummingbirds with sugar water. Just remember to change the sugar water on a regular basis. But most of all, just try to get out there and enjoy and be part of this great migration we have in the fall. It'll do you and your spirits a lot of good. But while you're out there, you might try keeping record of your sightings in the eBird app. You can get it for your phone, or you can go to the eBird website. Anyone can get a free account. This is becoming one of the great citizen science databases in the world for understanding distributions and movements of birds. So with that, I'm going to thank Lifetime Learning, and I'll just open things up for questions.
All right, thank you, Dave. This was a great, informative, and colorful presentation on fall bird migration. We have lots of questions. We'll try to get to a few of them. I have a question here from Jack Kavanaugh. He has owl houses installed near his pond, and he wonders how one lets the owls know that housing is available.
So they'll find it. I suppose maybe you have screech owl boxes, and I've heard people that have had those out in their yards for a couple of years, and nothing happens, but finally a screech owl finds that house, and once they do, they'll be incredibly loyal to it. So don't be disappointed, and don't lose hope if you don't get a screech owl right away. They'll eventually find that house.
All right, thanks, Dave. Anita asks, what are the typical life expectancies of the neotropical migrants?
Well, so life expectancy often varies with bird body size. And so our smallest neotropical migrant is the ruby-throated hummingbird here in Virginia. And it probably has a life expectancy of only a few years. They burn out really fast. Some of the bigger neotropical migrants, the hawks and that red knot I mentioned earlier, they can live 15 or more years. They can live a pretty long life. The wood thrush, like we have right here, it's probably somewhere in the middle, 6 or 7 years.
Okay, thanks for that. A lot of people did ask about the hummingbirds. This question is from Rebecca Bullock from Henrico, Virginia, and she has pileated woodpeckers that eat from her feeder, and she had suet out for them until about 2 summers ago. So she wonders if there's a particular suet flavor that they prefer.
So I get pileated woodpeckers at my suet feeder, but they seem to be very picky. And I don't think it's so much the suet I feed them is if they're hungry enough and desperate enough to come to my feeder. Pileated woodpeckers are very shy birds, and I think they only come into feeders when they might be having trouble finding food elsewhere. But yeah, I get them at my feeder, but whereas downy woodpeckers and red-bellied woodpeckers are everyday birds, pileateds are only a few times a season visitor.
And thank you for correcting my pronunciation on that, Dave.
Oh, people pronounce it both ways, pileated or pileated.
Oh, okay, great,
Yeah.
thanks. We have a few questions about migration on the eastern shore of Virginia and what to expect in the next week or so, and particularly about the egrets and the herons, the eagles and the ospreys.
So we are still in peak raptor migration, and if you go down to a place like Kiptopeek, especially tomorrow in the wake of this cold front, it might be an absolutely fabulous day. The broadwing hawks have all passed through, but the Cooper's hawks and sharpshins are just working their way through now, as are the falcons, which are my own personal favorites. The egrets are going to be thinning out on the eastern shore here as the weather gets cold. They often tend to stick around until they sort of get shoved out by the weather. The ospreys are probably pulling out right about now, but this weekend might be just absolutely fabulous on the eastern shore, and hawk migration will probably be good out there through the rest of the month.
All right, Dave, I think we have time for about 2 more questions. Someone wrote in about, let's see, John Gwynn, about the wildfires in California, and he wonders how this may impact migration in the bird population.
So we may already be seeing a little bit of the consequences of those wildfires. So there was a news story that came out in late September. It got a lot of coverage about thousands of dead birds being found in New Mexico and to a lesser extent Colorado. And it's believed that a lot of these birds were casualties from the fire, possibly displaced before they were ready to migrate. And as I mentioned, migration is all about getting the right amount of fuel. They perhaps were forced into a longer migration than they were equipped for, and were unable to find enough food and perished along the way.
All right, Dave, we're going to add a few more because a lot of questions keep coming in. Could you recommend a type of binoculars for a new birder?
Binoculars have become much more democratic recently. The high-end binoculars, the Swarovskis and Leicas and Zeiss binoculars, they're excellent, but they're going to set you back about $2,000. But the technology for making high-quality lenses with high-quality coatings has gotten much cheaper and much better. And so you can find binoculars in the $200 range that are quite good. The Nikon, I believe it's the Nikon Monarch, is a great economical introductory binocular, let's see, Kawa makes a couple of reasonably priced high quality binoculars. But I'll tell you what, if you send me, I've got a list, and if you send me an email at blandy@virginia.edu, I can get you a list of good binoculars.
All right, I think there are a lot of people who would be eager to find that out, and equally so, you mentioned some apps for birding, but do you have any guidebooks or field guidebooks that you could recommend?
Yes, in fact, I sort of anticipated this question. I get it in any talk I give on birds. So if you are a beginning birder, I mentioned Roger Tory Peterson earlier in my talk. You would be hard pressed to find a better field guide than Roger Tory Peterson's Birds of the Eastern United States or Western United States, whichever location you live in. For beginning birders, I find it just an excellent guide and an excellent way to learn the birds. The more advanced guide, the guide that a lot of birders have moved to nowadays, is the Sibley Guide to Birds. This is one version that's just for the Eastern United States. He has another for the West, and he's also got a field guide that combines the two. Those, as far as the paper guides, the physical books, those are the two I recommend most often to people. Both of them also have corresponding apps you can get for your phone. There's also an app called iBird that is great, and you can download that to your phone.
All right, thanks for that information. And again, to our audience, some of those resources are in the chat. And Dave, we have time for one more question. We had a few people, Anita and also Brian Kelly, ask about swifts. So apparently swifts have been landing on chimneys, and they wonder, is this unusual?
Chimney swifts use chimneys to breed. In fact, almost all chimney swifts nowadays come out of chimneys. Presumably, they once nested in hollow trees or perhaps in caves, but nowadays all chimney swifts, almost all chimney swifts, nest in man-made chimneys. And this time of year, you get huge concentrations of chimney swifts around some large urban chimneys, old smokestacks and things like that. And it's not uncommon to see hundreds, if not thousands, of swifts swirl in at dusk and work their way down into the chimney. It's a spectacular thing to see. We have such a chimney here in downtown Winchester that we often watch.
All right, Dave, thank you. We have so many more questions, but we're going to wrap up now. Thank you for taking us along on this migratory flight of birds in Virginia. And I think we're all eager to listen and watch for our feathered friends this weekend. Dave and his colleagues at Blandy Farm will be back with Lifetime Learning on November 11th to present a program on the spectacular fall transformation of ginkgo trees. Tune in at 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Our next Lifetime Learning program is Thursday, October 22nd at 6 o'clock p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, when we will present Centuries of Struggle, the Past, Present, and Future of the 19th Amendment. Heading toward Election Day, Lifetime Learning will present The Home Stretch, Election 2020, 1 week out, on Tuesday, October 27th at 3 o'clock p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. You can register for these programs and check out the full list of autumn events on the Lifetime Learning webpage at alumni.virginia.edu/learn. Until we meet again, be safe, stay engaged, and wahoo wah.